All right, so welcome to our webinar on the future of media. Ross Dawson is joining us from Sydney, Australia, so it's quite late there for him. Nighttime inspiration, I suppose. Ross, you want to do a short greeting?
Welcome, everyone. Great to be engaged. Sorry for the delay, and look forward to having a great conversation about the future of media.
Great. So again, the way we're going to do this is we're going to do a short presentation, trying to not make it too long, just about 8 to 10 minutes each, maybe even less. Then afterwards, we're going to publish all the material on Ross and GerdandRoss.com. GerdandRoss.com is a Tumblr blog we just started for some of the new stuff that we're doing together with the Futures Experience in helping companies sort of shape their future in media. We're also going to publish the entire audio track and the slides here from this seminar. Okay, so having said that, I'm going to jump right in. If you have questions, use the question box, please. If you do want to actually say something, we can give the microphone to you after the presentations. Okay, the sound is okay, I suppose. Yeah. Okay. Please use the chat box if you have any feedback or questions. And Ross is going to be active the whole time as well in terms of the audio, so he can also chime in. Oh, here we got more questions. Okay, good, good. Can you post here's a question. Can you post the links in which you're referring? Yes, we can. We'll do that all now. So let's get into it. I'm going to switch to full screen on the slide. If it's not looking right, then please let me know. This is the first time we're actually doing this, and should be fine. So anything else you want to add, Ross?
Nope, no, let's go for it and build it and make it a conversation.
Okay, great. So you see the slide full screen now, I guess, right? Nothing else?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, good start here. Okay, so Ross Dawson is at Ross Dawson on Twitter. I'm G Leonhard. Let's explain briefly what we do. We're basically dealing with foresights. We're not making predictions as futurists. We're trying to build future scenarios for our client to reinvent what they do in publishing and media technology, telecom, record labels, music publishers, magazines, broadcasters, and so on. You can see it at rossdawson.com and mediafuturist.com, and of course on gerdandross.com. We're launching a whole bunch of new stuff, future experience seminars starting September. We'll be going on the road together, Ross and myself, to help companies all over the world trying to figure out scenarios for the future of media. So I'm going to get right into the next slide. Shows you basically what's happening in the future of media. I think we're shifting, starting with music and also with motion pictures, now from a world of ownership, owning CDs and DVDs, to a world of access, which is a huge fundamental shift. Starting, if you look at news, for example, owning a newspaper and looking at the ad in the newspaper is a whole different proposition than having an app. Ross, feel free to chime in if you're always on here, right? So the biggest trend here is the social, local, mobile. The Facebook doctrine and cloud and video, and this changes the entire equation of who creates content, who pays for content, what we pay. In general, we can say that having access to content reduces the value of a unit sale like DVD or CDs to almost 80 to 90% in different embodiments. For example, if you buy a book, it's 15 euros. If you buy a Kindle book right now, it's maybe 12 euros or so. So it's a lot cheaper, but very soon it'll be 2 euros because of the friction that occurs in this, or the non-friction rather, that occurs in this new chain. The next slide shows you how I look at it. It's basically connecting the crowd and the cloud. You've heard me speak about this before. This is a crucial business model, is that basically all our media is moving into the cloud. Some of it will be printed and made into physical products, for quite some time. But that's not a real growth area, you can imagine. So connecting the cloud to smart devices is a huge business. I think we can all be very hopeful for this, because all of a sudden our costs of distribution are going towards zero. But of course, then again, the cost of attention is higher. So this is a challenge, connecting the crowd, but I think there's a lot of new business models, like making sense out of stuff, sense making, curation, filtering, packaging. The next slide shows you how I look at it. I think that basically we're heading into a multiple screen future, to where people are using best screen available wherever they are to do whatever they want, whether it's a TED video or a bank transaction or looking at my health records or watching a video or blogging. And that's going to be, the next 5 years is going to see that, when smart devices become something like $10 to buy, Like we can already buy the Cash tablet in India for $35, which is an Android tablet. So that's going to be a huge opportunity to figure out how to monetize. Will really take some ingenious doing, because clearly the business models of selling copies are pretty much unsustainable. Not in general terms everywhere, but in many other terms. The next slide is also very important. We have to really, as if you're in media business, you have to get out of the silo of thinking yourself as being in content or publishing, and the other guys are the telco guys, and the opponents are Google and the others. That's really no longer true. We don't live in silos anymore. In fact, I think the biggest opportunity in the future is teaming up with telcos, technology, internet companies, and creating new licensing standards, as I have proposed for digital music many times.
So good on that one. So I guess in what way or where are you seeing that the telcos are becoming media companies? I mean, clearly that's happening in quite a few ways. I mean, where are you seeing the most interesting parts of the telcos moving to become media companies and publishers?
Well, I call this a telemedia thing. Basically, what's happening is that in Europe and America, it's quite hard for telcos to change what they are because of regulation, and because they're so traditionally ingrained and making so much money. But in developing countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, Indonesia, all the telcos are realizing that if all they do is connect people for phone calls and data, that business model is not sustainable. SMS will die, right? Because clearly, if we have a data plan, why do we need SMS? That's just a question of habit. So you see companies like Telecom Indonesia that I work with, you see Singapore Telecom, you see Oi in Brazil, looking at ways of bundling content, media, advertising, and creating a whole new business model, which doesn't mean that they're going to become studios, you know, film studios, but they're going to become platforms for content. And this is a huge opportunity, provided that we are able to find sort of public licensing standards that are not going to be subject to jumping through hoops, as the music industry has proven is a bad model. I mean, I think you see this in Australia happening with Telstra, right? They're heading in this direction as well, don't they?
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess more and more telcos have, media or content divisions by name. And I suppose one of the critical aspects here is whoever controls the access to the home in terms of particularly, well, the pipes and the interfaces. So the interfaces are critical, the connectivity, so the set-top box or whatever it is that can channel content through to the home entertainment or the multiple screens in the home is an enormously powerful situation. So depending on the country, we're seeing either the telcos or the cable providers or sometimes the ISPs, well, certainly all of them, try and positioning themselves to be that conduit, to be that hub that which can then be the aggregator of the content providers. And that's where telcos are a very strong position, but some have been better, more successful than others in putting themselves in that
Yeah, I mean, they're
conduit into the home.
yeah, they're in a strong position, but of course, on the other hand, they're really worried about the content industry basically stipulating really licensing deals that just can't be fulfilled, as we have seen again in music, right? So the main thing is, I think, for the content industry is to realize that a $3.5 trillion industry, which is telco, is the perfect vehicle to promote and sell content and find new business models. Because after all, when you have 5 billion people connected to smart devices, there is money in there, right? So
The critical thing then is who has the power, and so this is so. For example, we're seeing that because Apple's iTunes is well, it's they do have not quite pricing power over the content providers, though it is they do have a certain in certain categories they do. And so I suppose depending on the content category and on the types of media, we're seeing this different play between the amount of power of the content provider and the aggregator. And I think we're seeing the shift more towards video, where the aggregator or the distributor of content has far more pricing power, whereas we still haven't seen that erosion, certainly in Hollywood or certainly the contemporary music yet. That the interface, that play of power and pricing power is shifting in more and more towards that aggregator, those who are flowing that through to the final buyer.
Yeah, I mean the pricing power is clearly shifting towards the consumer. What are they willing to pay? Which is the freemium stuff, of course, and of course the platforms. But at the same time, Apple isn't a telco, right? So I mean, Apple has succeeded in creating a fake empire of fake solutions. That some of us really like, including myself. But it's not really a solution to the issue of media delivery, right? Because they sell hardware in the back of their offering. We'll get back to this later. Let's go on the next slide. I think very important is that selling digital content really means that there's a significant value reduction in unit sales. That's basically sucking the money down the pipeline here. And as Rory Sutherland has quoted here, what we are prepared to pay, it's completely subjective and incredibly contextual. So we have to find models that work in a digital environment, because if we compare the CDs and DVDs and even cable TV, the revenues are 1/10. So there needs to be a new generator, and Kevin Kelly talks about the new generatives, and Ross will talk about that in a slide later, creating value around the content. Um, Paywall, there's a short slide here taken from ClickSurf, which I find really good. The problem is, in my view, not the pay, it's the wall. In other words, if we find smarter ways to upsell people into paying, they will make a payment. I mean, look at Dropbox, look at Flickr, look at LinkedIn, which people are paying for. I mean, look at all the stuff that we're seeing in the content arena, whether it's the various apps like the one that I like to use, which is the Bonnier app. It's Popular Mechanic, or The Economist, or so on. It's not really the that people aren't willing to pay, is that we haven't found a really smart way to get them to the payment process, as you see in this slide. And the next one has a summary. Basically, I think we need to think about pay will, not pay wall. And that is the sure way to money. I mean, if people are paying for Farmville, they are paying for Netflix, they're paying for even for Google cloud servers now. I mean, they're paying for lots of things. So it's about paywall, not paywall. And I think paywalls may work in very few situations, but by and large, they will not. And I predict that the New York Times, for example, will have not much success with it, despite their current 900,000 subscribers. Next slide shows you what I call reason to pay. This is taken from TechDirt. The most important thing is, if you're going to ask for money online, you have to have reason to pay. Why are people paying? Is it more convenient? Is it quicker? Do you love the brand? Like New York Times, has the highest price of all the paid services. It's basically about finding a reason to pay, and then converting it at the highest possible number. But if you don't have a reason to get paid, then it's extremely difficult. I think many ways newspapers, for example, are realizing now, when they switch to digital, that they weren't that relevant to begin with, some of them at least. And that's why they can't convert. This is a real issue, because when you have a market monopoly like broadcasters or many newspapers, then when that's blowing apart, all of a sudden you're realizing that people were there because of the monopoly. This short slide here, premium feels like free, new generatives, that's sort of my marching order here for the content business. Creating an access-based model that feels like free. In many ways, that is Spotify or Pandora, and then upselling to added values. Ross will talk more about that as well. Great list here on the next slide from Kevin Kelly, talking about the new generatives, and I know that lots of these things have to be created. They don't really exist yet. For example, how do you package stuff that people are paying for it? How do you curate? How do people pay for curation? That is all sort of future stuff that is really, really powerful. And I think, in fact, these added values can possibly make more money than the content itself. In other ways, you could say meta content makes more money than content. Not to say that content isn't important, because it is, but the new generatives are basically the sort of cracking point. A couple of things that we're seeing in general, and then I'll pass over to Ross and to our questions. Maybe we can take a couple of questions in between. Going direct is becoming totally real. You can go direct on Kickstarter, on Google Singles, on Kindle Singles, on YouTube, I mean, there's lots of examples on this page. It's still very early, and obviously we can't all be funded by Kickstarter. Because that'd be a bit too many people pitching for money. But going direct is becoming very real. The next slide kind of shows how Louis C.K. is doing this. A really great comedian. He's selling his tickets directly on the web now, and he's selling his downloads to his videos. And he's extremely successful at this. And of course, if that becomes a model, not everybody is as good as Louis C.K., of course, but this becomes a bit of a digital Darwinism here. But basically, as a middleman, some of your publishers I saw on the list, or a middleman, you have to add a lot of value, or you actually become irrelevant because your position is melting. Um, Next slide basically shows how I look at it. I think in the media business, you have to disrupt what isn't really working, or you're going to be disrupted. And if you look at disruptive stuff like Napster originally did, but now Simfy, Spotify, RDO, Xbox Live, they're disrupting how it works, and content will go over the top. Next slide is about how Kindle has solved this issue of being a disruptor. They have essentially made a market. If you're looking at those two curves, right? The Kindle books that were sold are now actually more than the regular books, and so market making is really what we're looking for, and that's sort of the direction that I would point towards creating new revenue streams. And lastly, I think most importantly is that we're now entering an age of hyper collaboration. I call this the trend from ego to eco. Eco in the sense of connected, not in the sense of green only. Example being Spotify and Telia. If you have a Telia, which is a mobile provider in Sweden, if you have a Telia subscription, then Spotify is free. So rather than competing, I think it's all about hyper collaboration now. And that goes especially for the content industry and the telcos. And so I think this whole discussion about, culprits and people who are to blame for what happened, including the constant conversation about Google and YouTube and so on, we need to look for collaborative models, not for competitive models. So far, so good. Let me go back to this here. Okay. All right. So let me see. Do we have any urgent questions? Ross, any comments on what we have so far?
I think there's a few themes be good to come back to when perhaps we'll have to have gone through some of my things. I think curation and some of the models for curation and the roles of curation I think are particularly interesting. And I suppose coming back to, obviously what was one of the themes of the title of the session today, which you've talked about a lot, which is the payments and get the mechanisms, I suppose the different situations where you can build and getting some people to pay. So some themes I think to come back to.
Yeah, there is a question actually here that relates to this. A question about Apple. There's a question here from Rhonda Lowry. Hello, Rhonda. Um, asking a question about why Apple is creating a fake empire. And I don't know if you agree with this, Ross, but basically my view is that Apple has created an empire of unit sales. You buy one song at a time, you buy one movie at a time, which works great if you're okay with the strict terms, like, watching it for 24 hours or so. And it works for people who don't really care about the terms or the money, but it only covers a very small fraction of the world that is interested in content. It's very much like, if you buy a Kindle book for the same price in the print, you kind of feel cheated. So those are not really solutions. They work to some degree and they have made money, but they are not a final solution. They're essentially creating a reason to buy Apple's hardware. And if you're looking at Apple's revenue streams, Apple only makes 4% of the entire revenues with content, right? The rest is selling stuff. So my view is that telcos would be a much better place to leverage the power of content than Apple would be, because Apple will always look to make their hardware more valuable by basically bundling content in a way that makes their hardware interesting. Ross, what's your view on that?
That's a really interesting perspective. The I mean the reason why, I mean, if you look back on the history of it, it was because they sold lots of iPods that they were then able to set up iTunes, which means in turn they're able to have a home where they can, again, as you say, link the hardware, link the devices to the machine. So iTunes, you essentially need your Apple's devices to access that. They try to tie them in very closely. So I wouldn't quite call it a fake empire, but it is predicated on the desirability of the the hardware of the devices. So at the moment, that's looking very, very solid. If you start to look, sometime into the future, that could be more questionable. But yes, it is interesting that it is, I suppose, to varying degrees, a gated community in terms of having to opt in into other forms, including the devices, if you want to access the content through iTunes. But because they do currently have that extraordinary play, particularly in phones and particularly in tablets, or even more so in tablets, that does mean, again, that the content holders do have to significantly go through them. They do have pricing power. The issue of exclusivity and the degree to which they're able to get exclusive content is still not quite there. So I think that they're in a very solid position, but it does mean that they do have to maintain the desirability and the market reach of their devices, which pretty safe for the next few years. Beyond that, it's more of an open question.
Yeah, I mean, don't get me wrong on Apple on this, everyone. I love Apple. I'm an Apple cultist, obviously. But having said that, Apple is a beautiful walled garden. And in my view, the beautiful walled garden will not scale beyond what we have now. So it's not going to be a solution to buy one song at a time on Apple. And even if Apple was offering a subscription for 10 or 15 or $20 a month, that would have to be bundled so it can be subsidized. And Apple doesn't bundle. Apple doesn't collaborate, right? So let's go to the other question here from Stephen Röhm. He's talking about asking the question: aren't the Japanese players like NTT Docomo and SoftBank already content players? And the answer is clearly yes. And in Japan, that is of course the culture. Most of music is bought on the mobile phone in Japan. And clearly, we're seeing this in all kind of countries that are non-traditional. Europe, it's very hard because they're making so much money with calls and SIM cards. That they're looking at staying clear of the discussion about content. Not all of them, but to a large degree. Um, okay, there is another question here. Again from Rhonda about the first generation of hyper collaboration. Saying that the early 2000 models with content providers were there, but the model didn't hold. What's different now? Good question, Rhonda. Ross, do you have an answer for that, or?
No, so sorry, I can't read the question.
Well, the
What was
question was
the?
about, the hyper collaboration model was already there in the first phase of the internet, right? How to create mutually good business models for content, and it didn't work. So the question is, what is different now? Why would it work now?
I mean, I think it is an interesting question. I mean, I think generally that it's a lot of the models of today, or what we're seeing today, were perfectly possible, quite some years ago, 5 or even 10 years ago. And part of what changes, obviously, degree of connectivity, bandwidth, but it is to a certain extent attitudes of how people use the web and how businesses are collaborating. I think it's interesting when we look back at just, for example, APIs as a foundation for the net of today. It was just, it was very significantly because Google started to introduce a bunch of APIs around some of their services. That started at the time to set a trend, as it were, for a lot of other companies were starting to release APIs, and now it's de facto. It's standard. It was very hard to create a new service unless you were using APIs or opening up APIs. So that was almost an accident of how the systems have developed. So now we do have a very richly interconnected lattice of services and companies and how things are created, and this is part of the attitudes which have somehow been shaped. I mean, it's interesting. We can preach openness and transparency and honesty in these things, and I think that a lot of these things have been rewarded and have been brought to reality in various ways by a lot of these moves and open flows of information.
Yeah,
It's
I think the substantial difference now is that you just have a lot more people connected at much higher speed, and we're finally actually collaborating online. All the models we talked about in the 90s weren't wrong; they were just way too early because people couldn't connect; it was too expensive. And when you see this in the curve in 5 years from now, when you have very cheap mobile high-speed devices for $10, for $20 in developing countries, and bundled internet access, everybody can chime in and collaborate and create movies and do all these things, and it'll be quite chaotic in many ways, but this is really a difference as to what it was in 10 years ago when only the privileged were online. Let's switch over to Ross. Okay, I'm going to see if the presentation changer here works. Okay, I'm going to switch over to Ross Dawson as presenter. Okay, okay, Ross, are you there? Okay, hello, Ross, are you still there? Okay, hold on here. Okay. Ross, are you still there? Okay, I don't hear anything. So maybe
Right.
Ross, are you there?
Yep. Can you
Hey, all right.
see?
Okay, is your slide up? Because
Yep.
you're the
Okay.
presenter now.
Great. Okay. So for um, the those who followed my work for a long time will remember this framework from many years ago I created. And I suppose the reason I was putting this up is that if we look at the future media and changing media landscape, that a lot of the foundations and the platforms are the same as they have been. It's content, format, revenue, distribution, and increasingly this whole interplay between what we can characterize as mainstream media and social media, which are feeding off each other. So these are what we're seeing today has been we've been able to anticipate and see coming, and now it's just different configurations that we're able to see in terms of how these different elements come together, and that's what we're still playing with. Same elements, somewhat evolved over time. So this is one of the frameworks I'm best known for is the newspaper extinction timeline, which is let's see, it's around more than 18 months ago now that I put this out, and since then, particularly over in fact the last few months, and I suppose one of the comments I should always make about this framework is that I don't really believe in making forecasts. I think that any forecast you make is going to be wrong, and I think these forecasts are going to be wrong. They're my best estimates, or best estimates at the time that I put these out. And the reason is to try to provoke some more structured thinking. So, for example, if people disagree with me, then hopefully they will think through why they disagree with me. But anyway, in fact, over the last years, I have started to think that these are going to shift earlier in many cases. So one of the things I was in Moscow recently and was able to experience a little bit the landscape there. And I suppose, as suggested by my frameworks, there's quite a big difference between metro Russia, which is mainly Moscow, and to degree St. Petersburg, as well as rural Russia. But one of the key variables in the second page of the framework that I draw out is the variation between countries around how much people are willing to pay for different things, including news. And I think that Russia is perhaps not the only country where people generally don't like to pay for, amongst other things, news. And I think that seeing the challenges there and the pace of change and the pace of behavioral change suggests that we could see certainly metropolitan Russia, Moscow and so on, be somewhat earlier in terms of the essential death of news on paper. I live in Sydney, and a few weeks ago we had some pretty interesting news from both Fairfax and News Limited, the major, predominant and very heavily dominant news organizations here, basically announcing very significant layoffs, major cost cutting, a shift to digital first by Fairfax, which has been very much a newspaper. I think a pretty safe forecast is that the Sydney and Melbourne major newspapers, Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, will shift to uh, weekend only in the not too distant future. Basically, the weekend editions do extremely well. They're still quite fat. They still got lots of advertising. They're still very well read. It is very difficult to make money on the weekday ones. We've already seen, obviously, the New Orleans Times-Picayune do a similar move to publishing 3 days a week. So we're starting to see some quite different dynamics around, and I think acceleration of some of the timelines which I'm seeing. And I think 2022, which was the forecast for Australia, is looking pretty optimistic right now if you're on the newspaper front. So part of the thing is that this is that newspapers become irrelevant or insignificant, and the news on paper will exist in a few forms. I think it's interesting to get more shapes around that, and I think two of the areas we look to for where news on paper will remain, which is a tiny fraction of what they are today. One is in highly community based, so sometimes suburbs, sometimes local areas where it's not necessarily published every day. There's a lot of local advertisers, a local community, so you're intrinsically targeted advertising, and there is the dynamics stack up far better. We're likely to see them last better than in general metropolitan areas. There are obviously a few landmark papers, such as New York Times, arguably, and some other major metro papers that will last. And the other part is the very interesting one is free newspapers. It's interesting. So the last dozen years, the newspaper industry has sort of leapt on board free papers as the savior, and in some cases gone a little too far and had them closed down. So there is a role for free papers, though I believe that the value of advertising in free newspapers is lower than the cost of the advertising in many cases. And I think it is going to be a lot harder. I think we will still see free papers. There is still a role for them, but I think that will significantly shrink in coming years.
Can I chime in for a second, Ross?
On the newspapers, good?
Yes,
Yeah.
a short comment on this. There's a lot of really interesting technology recently, including a thing called Layer, which is creating augmented reality applications that go on top of newspapers. So we're now seeing this combination of print and digital coming. For example, with this app, it's called Layer with an A. You can actually just scan any icon or so on a regular newspaper without any electronic stuff in it, and you can find augmented reality content like videos and links and tweets and whatever with your mobile phone while you're reading. And this will really be a saving grace for print, because now I can read the New York Times, and if it was layer enabled, which doesn't take much, I can find extra content by connecting directly from the newspaper page to my mobile. Quite
I think
cool,
that's useful, though, to a point once you're starting to move into the technology access in a way that paper is starting to become redundant in any case. So it's an interesting move, and I think there are a few technologies that enable that sort of technology layer or additional content layer on print. One of the other, I think, very interesting technologies, which has been researched on in a UK university, which I blogged about recently, which essentially gives a technology digitally enables paper. So I've long said that it is digital paper and e-ink, which will truly replace it when we start to have all of the positive characteristics of paper. You can fold it and roll it, and passive light and all of these wonderful things, as well as all of the qualities of digital. But if we can actually take paper as we know it and be able to find various ways to be able to digitally enable it, touch enable it, and to bring up data and so on. That effectively also provides solutions. So that basically takes into a digital product. I mean, it's no longer the news on paper that we think of it as today.
There's a question here, by the way, Ross. How, you're going to publish the link to your slideshow later? That will be a good thing, because it seems like people want that later. So, yeah, go ahead.
So, crowdsourcing is one of my big themes, and my most recent book, Getting Results from Crowds, was on on this theme. I think, which is critically important. So, if you look at the intersection of crowdsourcing, so a lot of I think people misunderstand how this will play out, and most journalists, the vast majority of journalists, sort of poo-poo the idea of crowdsourcing, the idea of crowds, or the uneducated in the ways of journalists being able to replace them. I think in almost every case that it is the pro-am, the professional amateur, the collaboration of the professional and the amateur. And so this is where one of the things which addresses this point of the quality of journalism. So the reality is newsrooms around the world have smaller and smaller staffs. That is a fact. And the way in which to be able to shift this so this does not have a negative impact on the quality of journalism, I believe that we have the potential to move to higher quality journalism is using crowds effectively, which means that the professionals who understand the processes can engage and do that. So, and also the point of this slide is that journalism has many elements, and parts of them can be done by crowds. So reporting most obviously by things like Twitter or CNN report or many other things where people who are on the ground, who are where things are happening, can report information. That's clearly adding value. There
Mhm.
is researching, and so for example, the Guardian's MP expenses most obviously, where more and more you say, let's do some research, let's uncover some information, where individuals are tasked by journalists or editors. Filtering, that's more and more done by social news services like Get, Prismatic, and Post and Zeit and many other ones. Validation, I think, is an interesting one because Twitter is unvalidated when usually if it appears on CNN or New York Times, it has been validated. And that still is largely a editorial or journalistic task. So I think there's elements of that that can go out to the crowd. Analysis, again, there's lots of things you can slice up and to ask people to do for you in the crowd to contribute. Copy editing, there's lots of mechanisms to be able to throw that. Metadata is interesting. BBC just has an initiative out to be able to help the crowd to generate metadata to make their information more findable, searchable, and so on. Reputation is critical, and I think that I'm very interested in reputation of journalists, reputation of news sources, and now again we can start to look for reputation of citizen journalists. And this reputation is intrinsically crowdsourced, as in many people are contributing to be able to generate that, and that's what enables us to filter many contributions to make sense of that, to be able to create what's valuable. And clearly we are getting crowdfunding, where for example, Mata, the New Technology magazine, is being funded by the crowd. So crowds are really relevant. Together with the professional, that's where they create value.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think this is a very powerful list. The main issue here is going to be about finding a way to deal with the noise issue. Because obviously the crowds are more noisy, and this is if you look at the last 3 weeks, there have been at least a dozen features around the web, including the New York Times, about how we're getting distracted by all the noise. Right. So this to me is like if there is a tool that cuts down the noise and increases the value and gets our brain to be lined up, with the mission, which is to learn something, to understand something, that's worth real money. And this, I think, your next slide here, the revenue
Absolutely.
model, obviously speaks to that. Yeah. There's a question. I don't know if you want to answer that now or later, but Jonathan Marks is asking, what do you think will happen to radio as part of the question? What happens to media and journalism? Do you want to go on that later, or?
Yeah, no, they'll just now. So radio is is in fact one of the channels which I think is going to last the longest and close to its current form. And one of the reasons is simply that we have the broadcast stations in place. The shift to IP distribution to moving vehicles is harder, is harder than to fixed points, or even to people who are sitting in a room somewhere. But
Mhm.
what we will start to do is slice the what is currently done over radio into more and more segments. So one of the really important things on radio, which is mainly local, is traffic. Another is weather. Another is local news. And then you start to get more city or regional based commentary, and a lot of the, I suppose, breakfast shows and so on are largely around engaging with what are communities. And music can be global. So we can start to then move to radio being sliced into just a single channel to people who are very often in cars, sometimes at homes, being able to slice up and to create their own show where you get a global component, which may be their favorite music, interspersed with some of their commentary from a person in their city, interspersed with, if they're in a car, they would choose to get some of the traffic news, or more generally, they could choose to get the weather news. So we start to get this slicing down of different components of radio, which still can, and if you're in, at a home or in a car, or moving around, you can actually find some ways to intersperse IP streams of digital content through to traditional broadcast of some of the more traditional radio content. So I think that's an interesting um, uh, direction.
I mean, I have a slightly more pessimistic view on radio because the way I look at it and the way I see it, pretty much anywhere I go, as soon as you can connect another device to your car radio, which is now becoming a standard, USB and Bluetooth, and just plugging your device in. Kids don't listen to radio anymore. And that becomes a real problem. I think, if you're looking at apps like dar.fm by Michael Robertson, where you can actually record that stuff, all that stuff should be done by the radio stations themselves. I mean, my view is that if they don't push the envelope and get more licenses and make it available in a way, they'll be insignificant very, very quickly, apart from weather and sports and talk. But music radio or that sort of thing, I think basically that is going to be a challenge. But talk about the media revenue models. I think this is an important slide. So
Yeah, well, we don't have too much time, so just talking a big brush. I mean, part of the point of this framework is to show that there are many revenue models. Classically, content and advertising are the models which the vast majority of media tap into. Yet there are many other new forms. And so the part of it is being able to not just look at them individually, but also look at how these all combine together as part of a whole set of revenue models, some of which can provide reasonable revenue in the short term, some of others which will build over time, become part of a broader media franchise, and looking at how value is created, making sure the value is added, which relates to another framework on the newscape. So I just want to say a couple of words on community, because I think that almost every media channel, what its really significant set of business models in the future are based around community. And almost every media organization will say, we are a community organization. We are, that's the heart of our business. That's talk more than reality in almost all cases, because it is still a hub and spoke model. It is all about broadcasting, yes, to a lot of people that are a community, but they are not enabling the community. They are not the community. They are simply broadcasting to that community. So community business models, I think, and a great example of that, a nice example of that is Deseret News in Salt Lake City, which has done a lot of things in enabling its community, and it has a very cohesive community around it, which obviously helps. But it's and one of the key elements of that is in terms of the contributions of its readership and its audience to the content and so on. But another one which they are looking for, which is around the monetization, is essentially around offering. I don't want to correlate too closely to the group buying syndrome, but that's a lot of what it is. Essentially, a community, part of what a real community platform can do is to enable more revenue to go to local suppliers, be they restaurants or be they hardware stores or be whatever they may be, and at the same time be giving value to their community and providing better value. So great advantage of this truly is a community style value. And there is monetization in it. There's ways of making money. So ways where you're not getting a large corporation being able to skim off some of these values, but you are helping money to stay within the community and taking some of that money for yourself. So I think this idea of building community business models which create value for the community and where there is value which the media organization can take out are really important.
okay.
So we only have a little time left to sort of speak on either the themes which I've raised or Gerd has or others. So are there any other questions now or anything good you want to sort of bring up out of what I've run through?
Yeah, there's a couple of questions here. First, I want to see if Scott Evans is still on the line, because Scott has a question. Let me see if I can actually get Scott on the microphone here. Scott, are you still there? I'm going to put you on the microphone here a second so you can ask your question, okay? And Scott, are you there?
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, you're there. Okay, let's put, this is Scott Evans from the UK here. He works for Social Vibe. He has a question, so can you just bring forth your question and we can discuss it?
Yeah, hi guys. Yeah, it's just a quick one really. Obviously, much like you guys, I've been in this arena for many, many years, and from, I guess, from a media perspective, a content-driven perspective, I think the way the market's maturity is as such that I just wondered what your perspective was in terms of, given that consumers are becoming more media aware on a daily basis, in terms of the future, is there a sort of what is your kind of approach in terms of, do you think that it's about time that brands realize this and chose, rather than bullying consumers for their attention by using traditional disruptive means of display advertising, such as digital display, if they should start to look towards models whereby, with walled gardens and payment walls, as you talked about earlier, Gert, they help consumers in terms of maybe offering them something in exchange for their attention, in terms of giving them, I don't know, access to article bundles, music content, that kind of thing, and have, I guess, an open contract with people who are aware that their attention is valuable, and give them something in exchange for that.
Yeah, I respond to this quickly. I mean, and then we could put over to Ross. But you can already see that branded content and brands and advertisers sponsoring content is a major trend. In the U.S., Pandora.com, which has 75 million users into active radio, is mainly sponsored by Beck's beer, and Beck says this is the best thing they've ever done in terms of reaching people, and they're not intrusive. So this whole idea of being not intrusive, of adding value, of facilitating commerce, that's a huge thing for brands, and that will be, in my view, be a very large piece of online advertising will be presented in this way. And the second thing is that, however, I think that many consumers will also opt not to see any ads or be left alone with advertising and just pay the money instead. This is a trend that we're seeing, people getting tired of being pitched stuff, right? So we're going to see both, I'm sure. I don't know, Ross, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, it's an important question, and I absolutely concur. Firstly, that brands will increasingly pay to create content rather than pay for advertising. There's obviously all sorts of issues around the credibility of the content and how well they can do that. But this is a very obvious trend, which no doubt will go further. The other thing is, when I look at paywalls, I call it the grand experiment, as in anybody that is trying to put up a wall around things that have previously been free or are largely free will, you've got to try different things. You've got to keep on trying. Is it the bundles? Is it the time of day thing? Is it the way in? Is it the quality of the stream? Or whatever it is. And I think that those who are trying to put up ways of pricing content that are more flexible, which enables them to do lots of experiments and see how people respond to them, the ones that are more likely to get to a point that is where they're able to sustain and to get paid content. And at this point, those that are trying to just sort of say this is the way it should be and trying to charge on that basis are more likely to fail. We're going to have to continue to experiment. People's attitudes will continue to evolve, and so that's as we continue to refine them and find out one of those many possibilities of creating more value for the consumer works in getting them to pay, then we will get to some value.
All right, thanks for this question, Scott. I had to unmute you because there's too much background stuff going on. See who else wants to ask a question. Is Jonathan Mark still there? He has a few questions. If you want to ask a live question, just give me a quick chat up here. There is another good question here from Simon Anderson. Simon says that in his view, the content-driven mobile experience will redefine how we interact with information and marketing. Can you speak to the impact of the recent introduction of the mobile 3.0 capabilities? Oh, and Qualcomm. I don't really have any news on Qualcomm, but Simon, in my view on this is, as far as the 3.0 is concerned, this goes back to what I said earlier about the SOLO-MO, social local mobile. We're essentially now in a whole different reiteration of what's happening with mobile devices, because finally they're useful. They're connected at very high speed. They're not longer going to be very costly. They have social and location built into the whole thing. So my view is that only in the last 12 months we have really had this possibility of connecting social with content and now with advertising. And this is why we have all the major issues about privacy, right? Because it's really becoming possible now. So I don't know if I would call it mobile 3.0, but in many ways, one could argue that the web really has only become useful in the last year or so, given all the possibilities. Ross, you want to comment on this? And then we have a question from Jonathan here on the microphone.
It's the the mobile's come a long way, and it's coming a lot further. I think it's extraordinary. It's I still sort of look at how much in developed countries anyway, tablets and the smartphones have come, and how much they have become where we access things. I still think that things like video glasses or other rich forms of being able to access, to interact with these devices and when we're out and about will continue to help that, but also voice as a controller so that we can really make the most of mobile platforms. But we've come a long way with mobile as a dominant, becoming a significant, almost dominant platform that's going to go further. This is the big shift which we're in the middle of now.
Great. So we have Jonathan Marks who wants to ask a live question. So I'm going to turn over the microphone, if I can, here to Jonathan Marks. Jonathan, are you there?
Hello, is it working?
Yeah, it's working. This is Jonathan Marks. He's an expert on radio and the future of radio and media, good friend of mine and colleague from the Netherlands. So welcome, Jonathan. What's the question?
Actually, the question is about whether you know any good examples of crowdfunding in Asia. I've been looking at how people have been trying to write books and make both radio and TV productions in Western Europe and North America, and I see some people are actually being quite successful in terms of raising, let's say, 10 to 50,000 pounds to make a production. But I'm just curious about whether anything like that is happening in Asia. I mean, I see a lot of people making videos, I see a lot of people making entertainment, but is anybody making factual content?
Yeah, very good question. I haven't really seen much of that. I think part of the the willingness to try these models is a sort of, of course, Americans jump on new stuff very quickly, and this is why we're seeing that first with Kickstarter in the US and now in the UK, right?
There are a few, and Singapore is one of the places where these have taken off the most. There's a number of crowdfunding sites out of Singapore. 8 Squirrels, Together, Asia, Firecracker. So we are. So these have taken a similar form to what we've seen in some of the US and so on for crowdfunding. There is a crowdsourcing week happening in April next year in Singapore, and then that's with a largely Asian focus. I suppose that there is number of sites in the markets. So I think it is still a bit patchy, but Singapore is one of the hubs where we're seeing more. There's a lot of interest in Japan that I'm aware of.
Hey Ross, can you mention again what is the title of the book and where can people get it?
Getting Results from Crowds is my recent book on crowdsourcing.
Okay, great. I muted you again, Jonathan. There's a question. Thanks for the question, Jonathan. Do you want to say something else? Did I turn you off too early? Let me put you back here. Do you want to say something else, Jonathan? No, good. Okay. Okay, sorry. All right, Vincent Loganier has a question at about half an hour ago, saying, "How do you see the business of Kickstarter in 10 years?" And I'd be interested to see what your view on this is, Ross, because my personal view is, I love Kickstarter and what they're doing, and Indiegogo and all the other places. I think that the issue is, of course, that if this becomes a default, then I'll be asked from all of my friends every single day to chime in somewhere. I'm not entirely sure that it can scale in that sort of fashion. Or what's your view?
I think it's interesting. I mean, the explosion of Kickstarter this year is staggering. The first $1 million Kickstarter project was on the 12th of February, if I remember rightly, and already we've obviously had a $10 million project, and I think there's another $5 million project this week, and so it's just taken off to an extraordinary degree. So these are largely pre-sales. The large Kickstarter projects are pre-sales. So this is, people are buying things. They're not sort of funding out of the goodness of their heart. They're saying, I'm going to commit some money because I know that I'm going to get something on the other side, or I have confidence that they're going to create something which will, build something good. So there will be some hiccups along the way, I think, but I think we should think of the crowdfunding and the Kickstarter model as very significantly a pre-sales model, and that's the bulk of the money which is being funded that way. What is going to be really interesting is the rise of equity crowdfunding in the wake of the Obama's Jobs Act signed into effect on the April the 5th. But that is, there's still some way until it actually becomes reality. And interesting, Kickstarter said we are not going to do equity crowdfunding for the foreseeable future. They're happy with their model, and they're going to let others do the equity crowdfunding, which I think is quite a different space. And I think that it will have a lot of impact, but it will take quite a while to be significant. And this crowdfunding adds very significantly pre-sales, and obviously to a significant as well, some goodwill is proven to be a solid model, and I think we're going to see a lot more.
Yeah, what I like about Kickstarter and aside to that as well is the fact that we don't just donate money like to Greenpeace or something. We actually get something back, like a custom-made book or a dinner, concert or whatever. I mean, and this is actually for the creators is a good thing, is because they have to create some sort of product-oriented choices. I'm doing a Kickstarter thing or probably an Indiegogo thing myself for my new book very soon. In the summer, my new book will be called From Ego to Eco. So there, you're welcome to then book a dinner with me if you feel like it. Okay, we have a few more questions. Here was a question about telcos from Paul Burney. I don't know if Paul is still on, but he's asking if telcos have such a big potential in content, then why are they struggling so much to move beyond the dumb pipe, smart pipe debate? And I think this is a great question because, in my view, again, because of telemedia, we're heading into a future to where that's becoming inevitable, because the only way to make it work, in my view, with content in the future is a combination of the shipping and the pipeline and the content value creation, because everything else is sort of fighting one against the other. Ross, do you have a comment on that? Or?
As many large organizations, their telcos have proven that it's difficult for them to change their sets and mentalities. And the other is that it is very difficult to build a content business that rivals the scale of their existing pipe revenues. So it's hard for them to pay attention for what, yes, may be the core part of their model and their revenues down the track, but it's just classic any large organization. It doesn't hit the next quarter or next few quarters, revenue or profitability. In fact, it costs money to initially to be able to build it. It takes vision, and it takes courage, and it takes big picture thinking, which is not always the case.
Well, this is one of the big challenges, of course, in the entire content and media and telco business, is that we're all thinking in quarterly instances, and this, I mean, this is a real issue with telcos, because they have huge potential, but they're always calculating return on investment with a bunch of spreadsheets that are based on, whatever data they have. But, the more sort of visionary views that people have, like Jeff Bezos have done with Amazon, and taking a leap into a new business, it's extremely difficult for them. But in my view, it's totally inevitable, and you'll see this in Asia first, I think, by the likes of Telkom Indonesia and Singtel and others. Paul Burney is still there, so I'm going to see if I can get Paul to actually say something in person. Paul, are you there?
Okay, I'm still there.
Okay, do you want to chime in on this question that you just asked about the telcos? You have.
Yeah, well, I mean, as you probably remember, Gerd, I work for the MMA, so I spend a lot of my time with telcos, and I'd agree with the comment you've made about the difficulty of breaking them out of the short-term thinking that they have, and I'm watching the struggles that many of them are having to break into mobile marketing, mobile advertising as being a business line that generates significant enough revenue for them to continue to work on it.
Yeah.
I can't say that I've seen any that I can think of at the moment who are making a success of either content creation or content distribution.
Yeah, it's funny, in a way, it's
if you think there are examples of people who are at least making a start in that space. I'd be interested to hear who you think.
Well, I think Orange and France Telecom has done some really interesting stuff there, even though they can't be considered to be fast in that sense, But at least they have acquired Deezer and make it work. And Telefonica is looking at this now with Telefonica Digital, right? So there's a bunch of things happening. I think in general, the telcos are a little bit like the oil companies, in which that they've made so much money with their existing infrastructure, and because they were largely monopolies for a long time, right, is now that they can't perceive of the next business. Clearly for the oil companies, the next business is wind, water, solar, and other things, but this is completely in a different side of the planet for them, right? And can they make
Yeah,
that leap?
They're almost the classic case of marketing myopia, aren't they? They can't
Yeah.
they can't see the businesses of the future because they're stuck in one vision of the current business.
This is why
Which
we
is
made,
essentially it's still immensely profitable for them as well.
Yeah, we may see companies like Google and stuff to take over that empty void. Ross, do you have any comment on that, or?
Yeah, it's going to be a real challenge.
Yeah, I mean we're facing this every day. We have to head towards the end here. There's one more question from Andre Prezern. How's the telco's interest in content different to that of a hardware company like Apple? I think this is a good final question. Ross, do you want to go on that first?
Sorry, what was it again?
How is the telco's interest in content different than that of a hardware company like Apple?
Well, I think it's a great question. I have often use the flow economy framework, which I first described in my book Living Networks. Say the 6 major elements to the flow economy. So most importantly, standards, relationships, content, services, connectivity, and interfaces. So everyone's trying to reposition across that landscape from whatever their starting point is. So if you're in the connectivity business, which the telcos have been, that clearly is becoming commoditized in various ways. So you're trying to shift to those other parts of the ecosystem, including content, including services, including relationships that you can then span into other domains. For example, financial services is most prominently. If you're in the hardware business, then if you've done that well, that's an interface part. And from there, again, you're trying to shift over into any other parts of the business. Apple is almost as distinct in the hardware business, and that it still has very strong margins there. So I think the most recent data I've seen is, I can't remember the actual numbers, but Apple has close to 90% of the total profitability in the smartphone handset market. And so it's not just a hardware manufacturer, it is a very distinct one which has able to make very strong margin, has escaped commoditization. But the telcos so Apple has moved from a very strong, profitable position where it is using, as we discussed before, its the content and the services and the relationships, iTunes-based relationships play, to be able to get more margin on particularly the hardware, which is the interfaces piece, whereas the telcos are moving from a position of weakness, as it were. They do have the pipes, but that doesn't give them the margins, and it doesn't give them a place to be able to easily shift into those other positions. So that's the challenge that they face.
Yeah, my short answer on this is why are they different? Is basically, to me, the content is in the cloud. It's not in the device. And Nokia tried this with Ovi and comes with music and failed miserably because the content is in the cloud. And who runs the cloud? It's not the hardware guys who run the cloud, at least for now. They run part of the system, but they don't run the network. So it's the network guys who run the cloud. And therefore, the logic of building the content business, which is moving into the cloud, into mobile devices and so on, is really a logic that goes with the network providers and the enablers and the people who run the connectivity between the cloud and the crowd. That's why I think there's a substantial uptake there, because there's a reason why you would use T-Mobile or O2 in Germany or so if there was a flat rate for books and music. There's a reason that this would all come together, because the numbers are very large. The numbers of users and so on. And there's a question here that's raised from Luke Magnuson. He said, could you elaborate on why you think it's inevitable that telcos are made for media? And more importantly, how do you think this will materialize customer proposition wise? Short answer on that, and then we really have to wrap up. From my point of view, is that it's inevitable that telcos add value, because just having a good data plan and a smart device isn't going to be enough for us very soon. It already really isn't. We want stuff included, and we want convenience, and we want sense making and curation, because we want value for our time and money. So they're going to have to add extra values, and the likes of the over-the-top players like Facebook and Twitter, they're always adding values and really competing, taken away from the attention of the telcos. So that to me is forces them to go to the content guys and say, come on, let's figure out a standard that we can collaborate. And the same goes for the content guys who are saying, if content moves over the top, like Spotify, Zimfi, RDO, and so on, there's no other solution than to figure out a commerce model that gets 5 billion people to be part of it, rather than, a couple 10 million people buying from iTunes. So that doesn't solve the problem. It creates basically inadvertent piracy, because, if you live in a country where you don't have iTunes, what are you going to do? Go to YouTube, I guess. So I think it forces the telcos to realize that without that, they're going to be marginalized, is my view. In a very short time, depending on what country you live in, it may be quicker than others. So, Ross, do you have a final word on that?
No, it's probably time to wrap up.
Yeah.
But,
so we're going to publish this webinar in the audio version on gerdandross.com, GERD and Ross.com. And also we're going to publish the slides, including Ross's slide on the website. It's a Tumblr blog. Thanks very much for joining us. If you enjoyed this, please do retweet the Tumblr post, which is going to go online in about an hour, and send it around to people. We're going to have a bunch of different shows on this. And again, Ross and me are hitting the road sometime later this year for seminars that we're doing for some of our larger clients, to help build the future of content around these rather thorny and sometimes convoluted issues. Ross is rossdawson.com. And what's your YouTube channel? Also Ross Dawson, right?
It's actually ROSSDAHD2.
Okay, maybe just Google Ross Dawson.
rossdawson.com.
And yeah, I'm very easy to find. I'm if you just put into Google, or Yahoo for that matter, put in Gerd Futurist, you'll find all my stuff, more than you can probably read in the next 5 years. All right, thanks very much for joining us. It's been a real pleasure. And Ross, thanks to you again as well.
It's great to do with you, Gerd, and fantastic. Thanks for everyone for attending and all your great questions and conversation.
Oh, by the way, before I forget it, for all the attendees, we do have a bunch of YouTube videos that you can see. If you just put in Gerd and Ross into YouTube, you can find, I think we made about 7 or 8, right, on various topics last year in beautiful Sydney. So you can see what we actually look like, and not that it's going to be a pleasure. But anyway, thanks very much for tuning in. We'll see you down the road. Bye.